Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Steve Knapp, and I'm president of the George Washington University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's special event co-sponsored by the Elliott School of International Affairs and our Institute for International Economic Policy. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to Michael Brown, Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs, Sean Roberts, Director of the Elliott School's International Development Studies Program, and James Foster, Director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, who will be moderating questions from the audience later in the program. One of the many ways in which we as an institution, and our students in particular, benefit from GW's location in the heart of this nation's capital is our proximity to some of the most important institutions in the world, certainly in this nation and in the world. And there's no better example of that than one of our nearest neighbors, in fact, right on our doorstep, the World Bank. We have a lot of relationships with the World Bank, and I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. More than 250 of our alumni work right close to us here at the bank. And as neighbors, we seek to develop robust partnerships in the areas of shared interest that I think connect us through our missions, and those include sustainability, public health, and international development. A recent example of our partnership is that just this past spring, Dr. Foster and World Bank Chief Economist Kaushik Basu taught a class to 160 students. The course addressed different strategies leaders use to try to shape foreign policy and economics, and also explored how students could apply what they were learning in the classroom in their own professions. The course featured guest lecturers and policy experts from GW, from the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. So with that background, it's my distinct honor as well as pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Yong Kim is the 12th president of the World Bank, and is the first president whose earlier career was focused on the very mission of the bank, alleviating global poverty. In fact, I'm happy to say that I'm actually wearing right now a pin that, thanks to the generosity of the World Bank staff, I was just given this pin, and it has a very simple statement on it. It simply says, "End poverty," an interest that, once again, our university very much shares with the World Bank, which is doing extraordinary work worldwide to address poverty. Dr. Kim is by training a physician and anthropologist. He's worked in the international development field for more than 2 decades. In 1987, he co-founded Partners in Health, an organization that works with poor communities on 4 continents. In 2003, he joined the World Health Organization as an advisor to the Director General, and he later served as the director of its department of HIV/AIDS. Alongside his work providing direct services to communities, Dr. Kim has actively pursued a distinguished career in the academy. He joined Harvard Medical School in 1993 as a guest lecturer and went on to hold professorships in medicine, social medicine, and human rights. He served as chair of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at the Harvard School of Public Health, and he was chief of the Division of Global Health Equity at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. In 2009, Dr. Kim became the 17th president of Dartmouth College. At Dartmouth, he founded the Center for Healthcare Delivery Services, a multidisciplinary institute dedicated to developing new models of healthcare delivery and achieving better healthcare outcomes at lower costs. Just 3 years later, Dr. Kim was nominated by President Barack Obama to lead the World Bank Group, a role he assumed on July 1, 2012. Kim received a bachelor's degree from Brown University before earning his Doctor of Medicine from Harvard. He's the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, was named one of America's 25 best leaders by U.S. News and World Report, and was also named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Yong Kim.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be back here in the Academy. You know, my team said that we should hold this lecture at 8 in the morning, and I said, no way. Students are just getting up about now, so I want to say good morning to all the students. It's always great to be back in an academic setting. Now, President Knapp, Dean Brown, distinguished faculty, students, and guests, it's just really great to be here today. It's a privilege to be here to talk with you. And we're going to start by looking a little bit at the challenges that are facing us in the world. We're working to become as effective as possible in improving the lives of the poor and vulnerable. But when we look across the world today and think about the most pressing issues, the ongoing fiscal uncertainty in the United States, of course, greatly concerns us. Our hope is that policymakers will resolve these issues soon, because the uncertainty, combined with other sources of volatility in the global economy, could do great damage, especially to emerging markets and other poor countries. In Africa, Asia, Latin America, these countries have done so much to lift their people out of poverty that we would hate to see those gains reversed. We also can't help but focus on the upheaval that's taking place in the Middle East. Syria is now in its 30th month of war, and the toll has been horrific. More than 100,000 people have been killed, 4 million people have been displaced, and another 2 million Syrians have fled and become refugees in neighboring countries, adding great burdens, especially to Jordan and Lebanon. The fighting continues within Syria, and the impact of broken lives and broken economies only grows by the day. We should not avert our gaze from the Middle East. The World Bank Group has been playing several roles. At times, we're in the back rooms with diplomats, and at others, we're on the front lines with humanitarian aid workers. Always, we're working with governments or companies or civil society groups to help build strong and sustainable foundations for development. This supports the livelihoods of millions of people in the Middle East and billions more around the world who aspire to good jobs, a good education, and access to quality health care. A critical part of our work is in countries emerging from conflict, affected by conflict, or stuck in a persistent state of fragility. As we know all too well, when a country remains in a long state of fragility, conflict often erupts. The World Bank Group and the wider global community need to confront the complex institutional and social challenges in these fragile states, because the cost of inaction is high and the reward of well-designed interventions is great. When we have the opportunity to build institutions, infrastructure, and human capacity in fragile states, or when we can put together a deal that brings in desperately needed private sector investment, we must seize it. When we fail to help countries develop in a way that's inclusive, or fail to help countries build strong governance, we're all affected by the result, which is often a country engulfed in flames, as is Syria today. Drivers of conflict in the Middle East, as we know, is complex. Most of the countries have experienced strong growth of 4 to 5% a year in the decade before the Arab Spring. Excuse me. Yet serious problems were lurking below the surface. An increasingly educated young middle class was frustrated that the few available jobs were reserved for those with more connections than talent. The private sector operated by earning privileges from the state, leading to a form of crony capitalism that only helped a few and undermined exports and jobs. The inequities and the anger filtered even to the very young. When 1 million people poured into Tahrir Square in Cairo in 2011, to protest their government, the children of the protesters held their own protests in the classrooms. They demanded better instruction. This is what happens when prosperity is reserved for a select few. All of those left out feel deeply the burn of inequity. The ongoing crises have left many Middle Eastern countries with a triple challenge. First is restoring macroeconomic stability. Second is reforming their economies to meet the high expectations of the people who marched in the streets. And third is managing the transition to new constitutions and more open, contested, multi-party elections. These challenges would be daunting for any single country, but they've all come together in one region. That makes it all the more important for the international community to marshal its resources to support those brave women and men who risk their lives to demand the basic human dignity that is their due. That also makes it important to come to the aid of Jordan and Lebanon today. The World Bank provided $150 million in emergency aid to Jordan just a few months ago, and we've just completed a comprehensive economic and social impact assessment of Lebanon that found the country has lost billions of dollars due to the war in Syria. Lebanon now is the host to more than 760,000 Syrian refugees. This would be the equivalent of the United States in a very short period of time, welcoming 56 million refugees, 45 million of which would have entered since January alone. Think of the disruption. Last week, I attended the UN General Assembly meeting of the International Support Group for Lebanon. Donors pledged some funds for the country, but we need to do much more or we risk catastrophe in Lebanon. Just 6 months ago, our board endorsed the 2 goals of the World Bank Group. The first is to end extreme poverty by 2030. The second is to boost shared prosperity by promoting real income growth for the bottom 40% of the population. How does this relate to the situation on the ground in the Middle East and in other poor countries? Well, the goal of ending extreme poverty stands on its own as the moral underpinning of all that we do. The fact that more than 1 billion people live on less than $1.25 a day in 2013 is a stain on our collective moral conscience. We must help lift people out of poverty without delay, without prejudice, no matter the circumstance, no matter the locale. Our second goal of boosting shared prosperity is more complex, but relevant to the entire world. The protests during the Arab Spring and the more recent ones in Turkey, Brazil, and South Africa were rooted in the universal desire to participate in the global middle class. Today, leaders around the world realize that boosting shared prosperity for the bottom 40% is becoming more and more critical to ensure stability of their governments. It used to be that much of this discontent boiled under the surface, but social media has created an enormous virtual middle class, as Thomas Friedman has called it, who will continue to knock on, then break down the door of opportunity. The lesson is that we should pay much more attention to whether growth reaches all the population and not just the elite. One way to do so is by looking beyond the overall GDP growth numbers. We need to directly monitor income gains among the bottom 40%. Economic progress must also be environmentally and financially sustainable over generations. So how can incomes of the less fortunate increase in a sustained way? Well, we know that there's more than one path to shared prosperity. One is through increased opportunities driven by greater economic growth. Another is through a stable social contract which focuses on raising the living standards of the poor and the disadvantaged. Both paths can lead to improved opportunities for citizens if societies can become more dynamic and productive with greater room for social mobility. Reaching our first goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030 will not only be historic, it will be extraordinarily difficult. Today, our economists estimate that the number of poor people hovers at just over 1 billion people, or 150 million fewer than in 2010. We're making progress, but nothing is assured in this battle, and it will get much tougher the closer we get to the goal. Global growth could be slower than historic trends. Disasters driven by climate change could reverse years of development success. Investors could become even more skittish. Long-term financing for much-needed infrastructure, already scarce, could dry up. At the World Bank Group, our 2 goals require us to deliver results for people. As Dr. Martin Luther King once said, our goals must be, and I quote, transform from thin paper to thick action. What will we do, all of us, to translate our plans into effective action to end poverty? Well, our answer at the World Bank Group is that for the first time, we have a strategy that will bring together the entire World Bank Group, the bank, which works with governments, IFC, our private sector arm, and the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, or MIGA, which provides political risk insurance. We just released it a few days ago. Never before have we defined a strategy that gives us a comprehensive roadmap to guide all parts of our institution around common goals and principles. Why is this important? Well, bureaucracies sometimes operate in ways that keep people away from each other. They tend to create self-enclosed areas of influence. These areas become well-guarded bunkers or silos. Some of those silos even become encrusted in titanium. I grew up in Iowa, and we had lots of silos. Those silos of corn stood starkly alone, especially during those long, cold winters, and I emphasize long, cold winters. Silos perform a critical function in Iowa, but they have no role at the World Bank Group. How can we or any other organization meet our highest aspirations of serving the poor if we work in a collection of silos. We need to connect the brilliant minds of our institutions to brilliant minds here at George Washington and all over the world so that knowledge flows freely. The World Bank Group strategy is based on the conviction that the entire organization will work together as a seamless whole to achieve our inspiring goals. And we know that if we are to have any chance to succeed, we must be selective. First, we must choose our priorities and then abandon those activities that don't make the cut. What will we stop doing? We won't continue working in areas in which others are better. We won't enter projects for the sole purpose of meeting volume targets for the year. We won't take on projects just to plant our flag on the ground. And we won't tolerate behavior that promotes individual interests over the common good. So what are our principles? We will ensure that all our activities have a relentless focus on our two goals. We'll become better partners to others so that we can together achieve those goals. We will be bold, and we'll take risks, smart risks. And by that, I mean that we will invest in projects that can help transform the development of a country or region, even if it means we might fail. We will excel at delivering local solutions by taking our global knowledge and making sure it's available to countries and companies that need it. We'll take advantage of our deep experience to lead cutting-edge global practices on issues such as finance, education, health, infrastructure, energy, and water. We'll always look for opportunities to help countries invest in their people. We must help countries become more competitive, and a powerful way for countries to become more competitive is by investing in the education, health, and job training of their citizens. And we will look to create innovative financial tools that can open up new opportunities for long-term financing that countries desperately need. Our strategy calls for us to become a solutions bank with results for the poor as our central benchmark. Three elements of the strategy are worth highlighting. First, we will partner with the private sector to use their expertise and capital to fight poverty. This is particularly important to create good jobs for the poor. In our last World Development Report, we pointed out that 90% of all jobs in the developing world are created in the private sector. Second, we will increase our commitment to fragile and conflict-affected states, which will require us to be bolder, take more risks, and commit more resources. And third, we'll be as ambitious as possible on issues that are of global importance, including investing in women and girls and combating climate change. Our response to climate change, for instance, must be bold enough to match the scope of the problem. On the first element, one of the highest priorities at the World Bank Group will be to help create jobs. How can we most effectively help regions and individual countries position themselves for private sector-led job growth? The scope of the challenge is daunting. The world needs to create 600 million new jobs over the next decade. A critical pathway out of poverty for the poor is through providing an open and transparent connection to local and global markets. This access can unlock entrepreneurial potential for millions. For example, one of IFC's clients, Ecom, connects cocoa, coffee, and cotton farmers in over 30 countries to global markets. Last year, Ecom helped more than 134,000 farmers and thousands more through farmer organizations. We're also expanding our group of partners to include those which are pioneering new business models. Just 2 weeks ago, I met Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, a Chinese firm that, among other things, accounted for 60% of the 8.8 billion packages mailed inside China last year. He showed me his black canvas shoes, which were made by a grandmother in a small village in China. Alibaba was able to drive logistics prices so low that this woman could market her shoes and ship them anywhere in China at a better price than the local shoe store or even the big markets in cities. In just a few years, Alibaba has fostered the creation or growth of over 6 million small and medium enterprises in China. That's an example of a transformational business model. But there are many environments that Alibaba even won't go into, and other companies stay away from as well. We at the World Bank Group serve as a trusted advisor to the private sector, and that often means we'll be the first to venture into a risky environment in order to make others feel more comfortable to invest. We know that there are several $trillion managed by sovereign wealth funds and institutional advisors, much of it sitting on the sidelines in low-performing funds. So we will actively work to find new ways to attract these private funds to developing country projects. One recent example was our launch of the Managed Co-Lending Portfolio program in China. The Chinese government agreed to invest $3 billion alongside IFC. Other companies and countries are expressing interest in the program as well. The second example of our strategy involves our commitment to taking risks in some of the most troubled places in the world, the so-called fragile and conflict-affected states and situations. Earlier this year, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and I traveled to the Great Lakes region of Africa to support the Peace, Security, and Cooperation Framework signed by 11 countries. And by the way, we were later to find out that this was the first time in history that the Secretary General of the United Nations and the President of the World Bank ever traveled on mission together. Now, in working out the logistics of that trip, we, I think, found out why it was the first time. It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing to do. But we did it. We're going to do it again sometime in November to the Sahel, and we will keep doing it to make the point, of course, that security and development go hand in hand. That region, the Great Lakes region, had been in a state of war for more than 2 decades, and rebel groups in the eastern Congo started a new battle days before we arrived. Just a couple of hours before we were to arrive in the eastern city of Goma, the groups called a ceasefire. Despite the tension, crowds of people, most of them women, lined the roads from the UN base to a local hospital that we were visiting. They cheered our convoy, but they also held signs that spoke of the deep trauma they've experienced. I'll never forget one woman's sign. It simply read, "Stop the rape." Indeed. We must move much more quickly, more urgently, to create peace dividends for countries emerging from years of conflict. We know that you can't have development without peace, but too often we forget that peace won't last without development. In the Great Lakes region, we moved quickly to amass an additional $1 billion assistance package to help the region. Shortly after our visit, the bank's board approved $340 million to help finance the Rusumo Falls run-of-the-river hydroelectric project to bring power to millions of people. Today, I pledge to significantly increase our support to fragile and conflict-affected states. I hope to increase the share of IDA core financing, which is, of course, the bank's fund for the poorest, to fragile states by about 50% in the next 3 years. IFC, our private sector arm, also will commit to increasing its support for fragile states by 50% over the next 3 years. The third and final example of our strategy is directly related to our shared prosperity goal. Shared means not only making sure that those at the bottom part of the pyramid are part of the growth process, but also that growth will not come at the expense of future generations. We need to share the planet and its resources with our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And that means that we have to have a bold plan to combat climate change. Climate change poses a fundamental threat to development in our lifetime. It has the potential to put prosperity out of reach for billions of people. Every region of the world will be affected, and those least able to adapt, the poor and most vulnerable, will be hit hardest. If we want to end extreme poverty, we have to build resilient communities and mitigate shocks like climate disasters so that poor people can make gains in their lives and keep those gains for the long term. Tackling climate change is not an effort that governments can take on alone. We need a response that brings together governments, the private sector, civil society, and individuals following a coordinated but ambitious plan. We can help in a lot of different ways, but perhaps most fruitfully by highlighting the increased costs of climate change and by mobilizing climate finance from the public and private sectors. The economic costs of extreme weather events are stunning. Coastal city flooding costs today $6 billion a year, but could reach $1 trillion a year by 2050. Investing $50 billion a year in protection would avoid these costs and free up $950 billion every year to invest in better schools, hospitals, and social safety nets. Today, I'm committing the World Bank Group to direct a greater share of our own financing toward this battle, and also to work with all partners interested in working on this problem in a serious way. Clean energy is our starting point. We'll bring together knowledge, best practice, and financial support for countries to address the high costs and policy barriers for the adoption of cleaner energy solutions. We're on track to complete renewable energy resource mapping in at least 10 countries over the next 3 years. We'll enable energy subsidy reforms, and this is a very difficult reform to go through, in at least 12 countries, and work with partners to create new business models for cooking and lighting that utilize the rapidly improving technology of microgrids. I'd also like to see at least 10,000 megawatts of additional capacity installed globally with our direct support in the next 3 years. That's equivalent to the entire installed capacity of Peru. We can reach our goals of ending poverty, boosting shared prosperity, and sharing that prosperity with future generations, but only if we work together with an altogether different sense of urgency. As I mentioned earlier, we must build a social movement to end poverty. That means we need help from all of you sitting here today, or watching this webcast, or hearing about it over Facebook or in a tweet. Just 6 months ago, the Board of Governors for the World Bank Group laid a foundation for a social movement by endorsing our 2 goals and declaring that we can end poverty by 2030. Now we're seeing interest from all corners. Political leaders, including President Obama and UK Prime Minister David Cameron, are calling for an end to poverty. Faith-based groups such as World Vision are calling for an end to poverty. The One Campaign, Oxfam, Save the Children, Results, and many other civil society groups are calling for an end to poverty. And young people are calling for an end to poverty. Just this past weekend, 60,000 people gathered on the Great Lawn of Central Park to watch the Global Citizens Festival, which rallied around the goal of zero poverty by 2030. By the way, I was on stage with Kings of Leon, who I'd never heard of before, and Katie Holmes, who I had heard of before but didn't quite know what she did, and I know you guys do. And all of them were there to call for the end of poverty. All of you here today, please join this movement, propel it forward. There are many things you can do, and you can do something from your seats right now on your smartphones. Log on to the Global Poverty Project website, www.zeropoverty2030.org. That's www.zeropoverty2030.org. And sign a petition to end poverty in a generation. Let world leaders know that this is an issue of fundamental importance to you. Our goals are clear. End extreme poverty by 2030. Boost prosperity, ensure that it's shared with the bottom 40% and with future generations. We have an opportunity to bend the arc of history and commit ourselves to do something that other generations have only dreamed of. At the Central Park concert, I called up on stage my 4-year-old son, Nico. It was a way to make this goal tangible to everybody. I said to them that when Nico is my height and a senior in college like some of you, we could hand over to him and his classmates and to you a world free of extreme poverty. I believe that this is the defining moral issue of our time. We cannot let over 1 billion people suffer in extreme poverty when we have the tools and the resources to change their lives for the better. We cannot allow the bottom 40% of the population to be denied opportunities for jobs, health, and education. We can do better. We have to do better. For Nico, for 4-year-olds all over the world, and for all future generations. For some problems like climate change, time is of the essence. But to quote Martin Luther King one more time, as he said, the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time, and we are the people. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Now President Kim has agreed to a short Q&A session, emphasizing students. I see some students from Professor Stephen Smith's class right to the left. So why don't we start with you?
Do we have microphones? Yeah.
Microphones will be coming right on
Now,
down.
remember, I've been a professor a long time, so I'll call on people if you don't raise your hand.
There you go.
Well, I had a question regarding, in terms of one of the major problems that kind of complicate development is issues with population growth and rising urbanization. And I wondered how is the World Bank going to reconcile those rising issues in facing their goals?
Well, the two issues that you brought up. Let me. In terms of population growth, I think that over the years there used to be a discourse that said the thing we have to do is to stop poor people from having more children. We don't do that anymore. And what we found is that reproductive rights and access to reproductive services is a critical thing, and that as society has become more prosperous, they tend to have fewer children. And so our position, and I think the position of the global development community, is pretty clear in that the most important thing for us is to make sure that economies grow, people have opportunities, and the women have the chance to make decisions about their own reproduction. But on urbanization, that's really a critical issue. So I was just in China, and last year when I went to China for the first time as president of the World Bank, I met with the premier, Li Keqiang, and just not 5 minutes after I sat down, he asked me to work with him to do a major study on urbanization. So think about the Chinese example. They've had hundreds of millions coming into cities, and over the next 20 years, they're going to have 300 million more. So they're going to have 1 billion people living in cities in a very short period of time. So the question is, what can they do to facilitate that movement of people into cities? And this is a question for everybody. So for us, urbanization is critical because, first of all, the cities are responsible for about 70% of all the carbon that goes in the air. So if we can get a handle on how cities are building right now, we have the potential to make huge gains in taking carbon out of the air. That's one. The other thing is that this is just how societies are going to develop. So the challenge we set for ourselves is, are we going to be able to provide for China and for every other country in the world all of the best examples of how to build green, clean, more livable cities? Something happened in China last year. I wasn't there, but I understand that the pollution was so bad that something happened, a frame shift in the way that the public thought about the importance of climate change, and especially the short-lived climate pollutants that were just everywhere. And so their seriousness about building cleaner cities, I'm really impressed with. And so he said to me, so how long will it take you to put this report together? And like any good academic, I said, at least 2 or 3 years. And he said, I'll give you 9 months. So we did it. We got more than 100 of our own staff, a whole bunch of people from China, and we're going to be publishing the study in December. And it will be a collection of all the best examples of clean, livable city kind of development in China, and also a lot of examples from outside of China. So if countries can invest in their people, health, education, social protection, and get their living environments right. It's everything from sort of urban design to transport to, if 300 million people come into the cities, how are you going to provide them healthcare and education? The urbanization question brings all these elements together in really an incredibly challenging but wonderful way. And we're committed to doing this. And so not only will China have all this information and insight for their own urbanization, but they're going to become what we call a knowledge hub. And they're going to provide those insights to all the other countries in the world who are interested. So you caught on an absolutely central problem. Yeah.
Right over here.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Kim. Thank you for your speech. I'm a Singaporean citizen, and I was wondering, how do you think strong economic players like Singapore can be better involved in the global movement to end poverty?
Yeah. Well, they are very involved, and I've met with the Prime Minister on several occasions. The Minister of Finance, the Tharman, is one of the most insightful people. I mean, one of the benefits of my new job is I get to see ministers of finance and central bank governors a lot, like 6 or 7 times a year, and so Singapore has given us fantastic examples in a lot of areas. For example, one of the things we do with the government of Singapore is we have a knowledge hub in Singapore focused on public-private partnerships. Now, this is really critical because if you look at the scope of official development assistance, aid as we call it, it's a big number, $125 billion a year, but it's tiny in comparison to the needs. So if you take the example of just Africa, Africa has probably about $100 billion a year in need for funding for new infrastructure. So you could spend all of your official development assistance just in Africa and barely make it. India has talked about a $1 trillion infrastructure deficit over the next 5 years. And again, they've been explicit. They said that they think with their government resources and aid, they can cover about half that amount, but the other half has to come from the private sector. So one of the things that I keep emphasizing is that, you know, I have not worked in the private sector myself, but one of the things I've learned is that embracing the private sector and their role in development is not about whether you like the private sector or you know, you have warm feelings about the private sector. The issue is, how high are your aspirations for poor people? I mean, if your aspirations for poor people are only related to ODA, then you actually have extremely low aspirations for poor people. If you have high aspirations for poor people, the question is different. It's how can we use our precious official development assistance, which really is, you know, an enormous and wonderful gift to the world. How can we use that to build the kind of infrastructure that will lead to the private sector investment that will create the jobs that we need? So Singapore has been critical in helping us think about these innovative public-private partnerships that will lead to the kinds of development gains we're looking for. So they've been a leader in that area. Their healthcare system, although their costs are going up now, their healthcare system is also a model. And so while Singapore is not one of the largest donors, in terms of the way they've run things and the way that they've built up their knowledge from having many successful experiments, we think they're going to play a really important role in the development of the future, especially around public-private partnerships.
Why don't we take right to that side? Yes. Yes. Please get a micro.
And tell me your name and sort of what you do.
Sure. I'm Nolan Dibert. I'm a MA in Asian Studies candidate at the Elliott School here. And my question is, given that poverty disproportionately affects women and girls, they're usually the ones excluded from financial institutions, they're excluded from formal education, they're not able to get the jobs, or in some cases not allowed to get the jobs that they need in order to participate in the economy. How is the World Bank working towards a more inclusive development that includes explicitly gender questions?
Yeah. So this has been a top priority for us for several years. You know, you may remember a few years ago, we put out our flagship report was on women and gender. And since, really before that time, but especially over the last decade, this has become a major priority for us. So now, one of the things we do is that every single one of our projects is what we call gender informed. Now, you know, that doesn't mean anything to the person on the street, but what it means for us is that for every single one of our projects, we know what the impact will be on women. And we understand how women will benefit from this particular project. And just putting that in there has made a difference for us. But one of the things that we work on is access to financial services and capital. There are still billions of people today who don't have a bank account and who can't access financing. And so when I was in China last year, one of the places I visited was a bank that we support that has a branch that is only for women. And it's specifically focused on providing both technical assistance and financing for women who want to start their jobs. You know, there's just no question, and we've said it in the World Development Report on gender, that investing in women and girls is really the smart thing to do. But the amazing thing is that we kind of reinvent the wheel all the time. You know, in Muhammad Yunus's work with the Grameen Bank, he found out long ago that providing loans to women is much better. But then when you go and you look at projects that started in, say, Mexico, the great Oportunidades project, which is a conditional cash transfer program, even though that experience in Grameen Bank was there, they also started out loaning to men. And of course, it was a disaster again, and they began loaning to women, and it worked. So the thing that we need to do is stop relearning every single time the importance of women and girls in development. And this is one of the things we're trying to do. We're been very inspired by the example of Malala Yousafzai in Pakistan. This is a real issue, that girls' access to schooling is one of the smartest investments you can make from a development perspective, but this is still an issue in many parts of the world. So this is very high on our agenda. We are making it one of the sort of foundational beams of what we do across the World Bank Group. And the next step for us is to set real targets. For example, how many women do we intend to get financial services over the next 5 years? How many women are we going to ensure have access to capital over the next 5 years? How many women are we going to connect to the market in the way that Alibaba has done, in the way that e-com has done? We've got to be explicit about what our targets are and then go about meeting them. So that's the commitment we've made over the next several years and part of our strategy.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rodrigo Riaza. I'm an undergraduate BA here at the Elliott School. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned this data, that 98% of all jobs are created by the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to connect that to a topic that really interests me, which is Africa. And I know it's a hard, difficult topic because it varies a lot between the continent. But I wanted to ask, what is the World Bank strategy due to the rise of international private investment in Africa right now? What's the strategy to control and make that international investment sustainable and increase it in the future?
No. So you're right. There's a lot of money going into Africa right now, but frankly, not nearly enough still. And so we're talking with all of our partners. For example, I was just in China a few weeks ago, and I met with the head of the Export-Import Bank, head of the China Development Bank, and what they were interested in is finding ways for us to collaborate. Maybe not co-invest, but finding ways for us to collaborate, because it's complicated to make a development project work. It's complicated to make a development project work and not be accused of actively violating human rights. These are things that take time to get good at doing. It's really important to consider environmental concerns, and we're very good at that. So I think it's not so much that we can control what these other investors do, but what we're finding is that more and more people who've now made major investments in Africa are coming to us and asking to borrow from our expertise in making these investments work. I think the issue is still, if you ask different people, I was just this past weekend, I was with President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, and she's very clear with me, and she says, look, they have enough energy. They have about 20 megawatts of installed capacity. So the country of Liberia uses the same amount of energy in one day as Texas Stadium, the home of the Dallas Cowboys, uses in one day. Same amount. So the people of Liberia, 1% of them have access to energy. And so President Johnson Sirleaf says to me, it's very simple. If I don't have energy, I don't have private sector investment. If I don't have private sector investment, I don't have jobs. And if I don't have jobs, my 35 to 45-year-old men, some of whom have done nothing but be soldiers their whole lives, could potentially pick up their weapons again. Right? So the needs coming from the African leaders are very clear. Right? Prime Minister Desalegn of Ethiopia is constantly talking to me about how we can help him prepare the ground for more private sector investment. Now, this is a huge challenge, but I think there are just enormous win-win-win situations. I mean, you look at a country like Nigeria, fast-growing, a very large country. They only have 20%. Now, Liberia has 1% of the energy they need, but even Nigeria has only 20% of the energy they need. Is there a possibility for us to set up a situation in which we can assure private investors to invest? Well, if we can, it means that people will have access to energy. It means that the private sector companies will make money, but also means that the overall cost of electricity for Nigerians will drop, and probably dramatically. So we see these win-win-win situations all over Africa, and part of it is that people are just worried, but that's Africa. I was in a major East Asian country, and I was talking to private investors about investing in Africa, and they said to me, frankly, we can see investing in maybe other Asian countries, but Africa is just too far away. And I said, well, what do you mean? Well, look what happened in Algeria, right, with the incident at the energy company, right? And I said, but Africa is not a country. It's really diverse, And we can tell you about investment climate differences between northern Mali and southern Mali. And I think part of the problem is that people just don't understand how much we already know, especially at IFC and MIGA, who are just constantly assessing risk and reward in these countries. I don't think they understand how much we know and how much we can reduce risk for those kinds of investments. So that's really the task. It's really having a conversation with all the different people who are investing and coming up with an approach that leads to real investment that creates good jobs for people, that's done in a way that doesn't destroy the environment, that's done in a way that respects the rights, especially of indigenous people. All that is doable, but we've just got to talk more and we've got to make the case. And that's what we're doing right now.
One more question. White in the back, right in the back.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Finkel. I'm studying international development, and I have a minor in anthropology. You mentioned, Mr. Kim, that security and development go hand in hand, and likewise, corruption and political instability often go hand in hand with underdevelopment. What is the World Bank's plan to improve these complex and unique situations to support sustainable economic development?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's a great question, and you know, it's the history of the World Bank and organizations like ours, you know, tackling corruption directly is it's not that long. It's actually the first time that a World Bank president ever uttered the word corruption was in 1996, and one of my predecessors, Jim Wolfenson, gave a speech when he talked about the cancer of corruption, and all of his advisors said, "You can't do that. You know, you can't actually say that word," and he did, and he began tackling it, and ever since, the bank has been completely committed to rooting out corruption. In fact, the very first day I became president of the World Bank Group, I walked in the door, they sat me down and said, "Okay, you've got to decide on canceling a project in Bangladesh." And this was the great Padma Bridge project, and you know, we had lots of other projects going on with Bangladesh that we thought were going on just fine, but in this one, there was clear evidence of corruption. So I had to cancel it on the very first day. And there were people outside protesting, et cetera. It happened like that. But the point that, that I'd like to make is that I don't think, I mean, we have to be really careful about being focused, rigorous, and evidence-based on when we point out corruption and when we don't. So in other words, we are constantly looking for corruption in projects. But we're not saying that a whole country is corrupt. We try not to anyway. We try not to make these broad generalizations because there's corruption everywhere. There's corruption in the developed world. In fact, the country that has the most cases of its companies being involved in corrupt practices is a developed country. Not, you know, it's not a developing country. So it's just a fact of life that when you're trying to build bridges or when you're trying to do good things in the economy, there's the possibility of corruption. So our approach is to be extremely rigorous and extremely aggressive about rooting out corruption. And when we find it, we point to it, we look at who is responsible, and then if companies are involved, we debar them, meaning they're not allowed to participate in any more World Bank projects. And then the good news is that we have something called cross-debarment. So if we debar somebody, then all the other multilateral development banks will debar them as well, and we have the same arrangement. So we have upped the ante and increased the stakes of being involved in corrupt practices, and we've been pretty good at capturing it. And so that's just the reality. It's no longer a matter of just broadly painting a country as corrupt, but it's saying in these kinds of projects, corruption is always possible. The thing we have to do is be really clear about our standards, uphold those standards, and when we find it, root it out, but not necessarily stop everything else that's going on in the country, especially if those other things are going well. Now, it's a hard thing to do. It is really hard, and we have an elaborate structure inside the World Bank that helps us detect these cases. It really is. And my predecessor, my immediate predecessor, Bob Selleck, put it really simply, and I think it's exactly right. He said, corruption is simply stealing from the poor, in especially in our case. In the World Bank case, corruption is stealing from the poor. It's simple as that. And so our position on it's clear. but we have found a way to very aggressively move forward, keep doing our projects, while at the same time rooting out corruption as much as possible. I actually have time for one more if you want.
Great. One more. Let's, right down in front. Yes.
Hello, Dr. Kim. My name is Jorge Benavides. I'm a physician and a graduate student in medical anthropology. You've talked about the importance of the private sector, but in healthcare, it's no secret that the best results have usually been attained by countries that have public healthcare systems. So I would like to know what's the position of the World Bank in terms of developing world and how the healthcare systems of their country are going to be developed in the future.
Yeah, you know, the really important thing that I want to point out here is that we are not ideological about any of these issues, right? So I think that ultimately, in many countries, what I've seen, my own experience has been that countries that have an all-public system can become extremely complacent, and the quality of services can be really bad. I've also seen many situations where the private sector is building hospitals like crazy, and it's exactly the wrong thing to do. Maybe because of my background, I find that leaders, especially ministers of finance and heads of state, are always asking me about healthcare. And usually it goes something like this, especially in middle-income countries. We've done what we thought was the right thing. We've built all these hospitals with all this great equipment, and my costs are soaring, and I have no evidence that my people are healthier, right? Exactly, right? So many countries are really recreating the mistakes of this country. So what we did in the United States, we built hospitals everywhere. And what did we learn? If you build a hospital, they will be full. And if you buy shiny equipment and put it in front of doctors, they will use it. And so you know, it's hard. Some people say it's hard to be overeducated. Maybe, but it is possible to be over-medicated and over-treated. We know that. So in this country, the estimates of experts is that 30 to 50% of what we spend on healthcare is not only wasted, but harmful, right? And I see countries all over the world going down this path where they're trying to recreate the American healthcare system. And this is the worst thing that they could do. So the step that we're taking is that we are bringing together what we're calling our health global practice. And the charge that I've given to them is, okay, I want to put together the best possible advice for especially middle-income countries, but all countries, on thinking about health. Now, education is similar, right? You know, my own country of birth, Korea, now has 80% of its high school graduates going to college. Germany has 40%. And Germany has developed a system where even if you don't go to college, and if you go to one of the great vocational schools, it's just as prestigious, and they do really well coming out of those schools. Germany has actively thought about matching their educational system to the needs of their market, right? Whereas in Korea, it's just too many. You know, Chile went from 10% to 50% in colleges, and now the argument is to go to 100%, and almost surely their market will not be able to absorb those new college graduates. So in health and education, I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of bringing evidence to bear to provide the best possible advice. Now, I have seen private medical schools in Peru, private hospitals in Peru, elevate the level of practice overall. And so I think there's a role for both the private and the public sector, but I think in health and education especially, the government has to play an extremely important role in setting a vision and then getting the incentives right so they get the kind of health and education system that they want. You know, I'm with ministers of finance and central bank governors all the time, and I'm in meetings with them all the time. And I'm usually the one who says something like this. And in February, at the G20 finance ministers meeting in Moscow, I said this. I said, and this was, you know, the U.S., all the G20, the top 20 economies, more or less. I said to them, I said, you know, I just want to say that every single one of you in this room has deep problems with your health and education system. And let me suggest that those of you who get it right, how to invest in your human beings over the next 5 to 10 years, will be more competitive in the future. And in fact, the strategic nature of your interventions in health and education may in fact determine your competitive position in the next 5 to 10 years. So, we went right back to talking about currency wars and the like, but then some of the finance ministers and central bank governors came to me afterwards and said, please keep saying these things, because we're all faced with these problems. We're under the gun of so many immediate pressures, but we know we've got to think about this. But at the World Bank Group, the other thing is we have to raise our game. We have to be able to walk into a room and say, okay, we've done the analysis of your healthcare system. And I was just in Moscow, and the mayor of Moscow was proudly telling me about the billions of dollars he spent on PET scanners and MRI machines and functional MRI machines. And I said, Mr. Mayor, you have a big problem. He said, what's that? You're a doctor, you'll love this, right? I said, no. The problem with all those machines is that your doctors will use them. Right? And at the same time, they had trouble getting healthcare to the outer oblasts, right? And same thing in Brazil, same thing in just about every middle-income country. So we need to be able to say to them, look, here's what you should do differently next week. I think a focus on primary care is not only good for middle-income countries, it's good for the United States. It's good for every country in the world. Measuring what you're actually doing in primary care would be really, really good. Being rational about which hospitals to build and which not to build. The president of Bulgaria came to me and he said, I have 450 hospitals in Bulgaria. Netherlands, there's a gentleman from the Netherlands sitting there. They have roughly the same population. They have 115 and they're closing a bunch of them. And he looked at me and he said, Mr. President, what do I do? My healthcare costs have been going like this. And how am I going to tell these legislators that thought it was a great idea to build a hospital in their district, how do I tell them to close hospitals? Big problem, really big problem. So we want to be the place that brings together evidence from the best thinkers in healthcare system development, the best thinkers in clinical management of patients, and what we bring is we bring the financial element. So given all these different ways of organizing your healthcare system, given your finances, your natural resources, your own economic strategy, what's the best thing for you? If we can do that, and if we can do that in other areas like energy and water, that I feel that we will be invaluable to the world. I think we are already quite valuable to the world, but if we can do that, I think that every country in the world, I hope, will want our help. Thanks very much for your questions and for your attention. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.